Okay, thank you so much. Today, Gabriel Dupre will present the explanatory economy and counterexamples in cognitive science. He is from University of California in Los Angeles. You have 30 minutes.
All right. So my talk is called The Explanatory Economy and Counterexamples in Cognitive Science. The explanatory economy is the name that I've given for a kind of a methodological approach to linguistics that I'm developing. I call it counterexamples in cognitive science. There will be a case study at the end if we have time, where I'll talk about the way that this sort of methodology could be applied more generally in cognitive science, not just in linguistics. In fact, I think, like everyone with a hammer, I think that a lot of cases in the sciences can be handled this way. In particular, in any of the complex sciences, there's a very particular kind of puzzle that's going to arise that I think this approach is good for solving. So I'm going to start by talking about the puzzle that it's supposed to be solving, namely the puzzle that we can get quite powerful generalizations, but they're always confronted with certain kinds of exceptions and anomalies. I'll then discuss what generative linguistics, the programming linguistic theory started by Noam Chomsky, how they deal with this problem, but in the past couple of decades has been dubbed the Galilean style. I'll say a little bit about what that is. Then I'll raise some, then I'll discuss some people who don't like this strategy, who think there's something deeply kind of unscientific about it. And then I'm going to show you my proposed solution to this puzzle. Sort of what I'll be doing is defending the Galilean style, but but I'll also be kind of expanding on it and showing that the way that it's phrased is often there's often something a little defective about it, and so we can solve this problem by adopting what I'm going to call the explanatory economy. As I said, I'll mostly be talking about linguistics and in particular generative linguistics. If we have time at the end, I'll discuss some further applications of this strategy. If we don't have time, I think it would be something that people could raise in Q&A if they're interested. All right, so just to get some background, linguistics, the science of linguistics is, as I'm understanding it, the project of describing and explaining the properties of human psychology, which explain our linguistic capacities. So this is the kind of mainstream assumption in linguistics, that really we should view linguistics as a branch of psychology. We're not particularly interested in patterns of sound in the air or patterns of ink on a page or the kind of external indicants of language. Instead, what we're interested in is the underlying psychology. Generative linguistics is a particular research program within the project of linguistics more generally, which aims to provide explanations for these linguistic capacities by positing particular sorts of formal, explicit systems, internalized systems of linguistic rules. So explanations in generative linguistics take the form, you've internalized these sorts of linguistic rules, and that explains why you display this sort of linguistic behavior. Fairly straightforward first pass at the methodology of generative linguistics. You propose some hypothesis, some internalized linguistic rule, and then you compare the outputs of that rule to human linguistic behavior. So the rule says, here are the sentences of English, and then you go ask some English speakers, what do you think of these sentences? And the hope is the ones that the rules of this internalized system license are the ones that English speakers say, yeah, they sound good, and vice versa for the bad cases. So these sets of rules, just like the kind of syntax of a formal system, they determine a set of expressions which are going to count as grammatical, analogous to well-formed, and then you compare this set to the set of sentences that English speakers deem acceptable. So just to get started with some data, obviously, linguistics is one of these sciences where the problem is not that our data set is incomplete. In fact, we have way too much data, precisely because data is very easy to come by. We don't need to do big high-powered experiments. We don't even need to scan people's brains. We don't need to do any of that. You just ask people, go down the corridor and say, how does this sentence sound to you? So data is very easy to come by. There's tons of it. I obviously will only focus on a very small amount, so I'm going to focus on WH questions in English. So here's just some preliminary data. What did Pierre read? Sounds good. If someone asks what did Pierre read, you don't have any unusual response to it. Similarly, who read what? You can ask not just about the object of the reading, but also about the subject in the same sentence. Both sound good. Pierre read what, at least as a first pass, is not a good sentence. I'll come back to this. I'm sure everyone is already thinking there are situations in which that's fine. That's going to be one of the things I want to talk about. But it is at least a datum that most of the time this is not an okay sentence. Most of this context in which you could ask, what did Pierre read? You couldn't ask, Pierre read what? If I tell you Pierre was at the library all day and you ask Pierre read what, I would think that's a very strange way for you to linguistically behave, as opposed to what did Pierre read? Even clearer case, if you try and ask this question with two WH expressions, where you're asking about the subject and the object of reading, if you try and put both of these words near the beginning of the sentence, it sounds really bad. What, who read? So there's no context, as far as I can tell, outside of the linguistics paper where that sentence would come up. So that's just the data. I've not said anything theoretical yet. Here's the only technical bit of the talk. Here are some linguistic hypotheses. Here are the kinds of hypotheses that generative linguists are going to use to try and account for this distribution of data. So the first one, I want to distinguish between two parts of a linguistic construction or a sentence. So just to foreshadow a bit, firstly, we have what we might call the kind of propositional part of the sentence. So here we have the subject, the verb, and the object. And the claim is that sentences of a natural language, as well as this propositional thing, have this thing higher up in the tree, what I'm calling C. C is a complementizer. It's analogous to that or whether. And the crucial role that it plays in sentences is indicating illocutionary force. So a particular complementizer, which we usually can't hear, at least in English, is hanging out there up at the top of the tree, indicating whether this is a question or whether it's an assertion or whether it's a command. So I'm going to say that these complementizers have these features, which that's their role. They tell you what the illocutionary force is. So I'm just going to use the plus Q here to indicate that's the feature that a complementizer has, indicating that this is interrogative. So that's the first linguistic hypothesis, just mandating that we have this kind of split structure with the kind of propositional content and then the interrogative, and then the illocutionary stuff. The second assumption I'm going to make, or the second linguistic hypothesis I'm going to rely on, is that this feature, this plus Q, which indicates that the structure is interrogative, is what linguists call a strong feature. What that means is it's illegitimate to find this thing in a tree, in a syntactic structure, unless it's nearby an expression with a similar sort of feature. So you can think of this as a kind of output constraint on our syntactic theories. If you generate an expression where you have this plus Q feature on the complementizer, and it isn't near something like a WH expression, the sentence is going to be bad. So this is all stated very abstractly. Hopefully it's a little clearer again in our structure here. So here we have the complementizer with the plus Q feature, and the claim is, as things stand, this tree is unacceptable, it's illegitimate, because this plus Q feature isn't nearby anything of the relevant sort. But there is something in the tree down here. We say this what, the WH expression has this as an analogous sort of feature. And so in order to make this tree legitimate, we have to move this feature up so that it can play this checking role, put it near the complementizer. So this tree on the right is legitimate because this plus Q feature has its nearby analogous feature, whereas this tree on the left is not. This is the basis for movement in general in linguistics. Movement of this sort, where you start with an expression in one location, move it to somewhere else, is motivated for precisely these sorts of reasons. All right. Finally, final hypothesis, if you find the same expression at multiple locations in the tree, you only pronounce the one that's higher up. So higher up, I'm not going to kind of give a formal definition, but all the trees I'll use, it'll be easy enough to read it off of them. Here, this is high, this is low. And so when we find this expression found at multiple locations in the tree, we only ever express the one that's higher up. So that's all the linguistics that you're going to need for the purposes of this talk. And so now I'm going to show how these linguistic hypotheses adequately account for the initial data that I discussed. First data, what did Pierre read? That is an acceptable sentence. The explanation is you start with this propositional thing down here. Pierre read what? And then in order to account for this plus Q feature, in order to check it, you need to move what up to the front. There's also this thing with did, which I'm not going to talk about for purposes of this paper. There's a similar sort of explanation that's given there. So this formal theory generates trees of this form. What did Pierre read? And that is matched by English speakers' intuitions that what did Pierre read is perfectly acceptable. Same sort of story for who read what. Again, you start with the propositional thing lower down. The only difference is in this case, you have 2 question words rather than just the one. You still have this problem that this plus Q feature up here needs a buddy, but this time you raise the subject expression, and so we start with who read what like this, and then we move one of these expressions higher up. So again, we generate a tree which can be pronounced as who read what. Again, you can kind of ignore the tense marking stuff here. Okay, so just as important as explaining what we do find okay, these theories have to explain why we find a lot of these sentences bad. And just going off the hypotheses that I mentioned a minute ago, Pierre read what is going to violate the third of those conditions. So assuming that we still need to check this plus Q feature. If we do that, we could produce a sentence Pierre read what, but we would have to pronounce the lower copy of the what rather than the higher copy. And we had this hypothesis that said we weren't able to do that. So this sentence is deemed, this structure is deemed ungrammatical by our linguistic theory, which is what we want because the sentence is deemed unacceptable by native English speakers. There's other little tweaks you could make, which I might mention. And finally, this other bad sentence, what who read. So we can think of this sentence as being formed by initially forming the sentence who read what, and then trying to do to what the same thing we did to who, and similarly moving it up to the front of the sentence. That's what we're seeing here. But the hypothesis was you explain these sorts of, you explain movement by talking about these complementizer expressions needing their features to be checked. This feature has already been checked, and so this movement is redundant. It doesn't do anything, and so this structure is not generated by these hypotheses. Okay, that all went by a little quickly, I imagine, but the kind of take-home message is just that what we're looking for when we're doing linguistics is getting this kind of mapping between the sets of structures generated consistently with linguistic hypotheses and the sets of linguistic expressions that speakers deem acceptable. And this is just a kind of gloss of how that works. All right. And so by making these hypotheses, one of the things that we've already accounted for is this sort of generalization about English that exactly one of these WH expressions has to be moved. If you don't move any expressions, you get sentences like Pierre read what, which, as I said, usually taken to be bad. If you try and move too many of these expressions, you get things like what who read, also bad. So we have this generalization. You always move exactly one. and you move one to the beginning of the sentence. And these hypotheses that we proposed can derive this generalization. You'll only get syntactic trees consistent with these hypotheses, which will mandate moving exactly one WH expression. All right, that's the linguistics bit. So here's just a kind of pictorial representation of that. On the one hand, we have the data that we're trying to account for. On the other hand, we have the theory. The data is any sentences marked with a green check are good. Any sentences marked with a red cross are bad. And the green arrow in the middle means these hypotheses, this theory correctly predicts these data. All right. And now back to this issue I raised a minute ago. There are circumstances in which Pierre read what sounds fine. Paradigmatically, they are questions in response to an assertion that Pierre read something. Someone tells you Pierre read War and Peace. You didn't hear them correctly. You respond, Pierre read what? So there are at least some circumstances where native English speakers think this sentence sounds fine. The question is, what does the linguist do about this? There seems to be an expression in our data set which contradicts the hypotheses put forward by our theory. That's what the little red cross means here. So what can we do? So I think if you read kind of traditional philosophy of science, you're going to propose something like, well, look, what we do is we had a bunch of hypotheses, we put them together, we derived some predictions. Those predictions turned out to be wrong. What does that show us? It shows we have to modify our theory, right? That's standard assumptions about how science works. There's various things you could do here. So one thing is you could reject this hypothesis that you pronounce the higher copy, and you say, look, sometimes you pronounce the higher copy, sometimes you pronounce the lower copy. That seems to be what we observed in this sense. Sometimes the higher copy is required. What did Pierre read? Other times the lower copy, Pierre read what? So you just say, look, this hypothesis was wrong. It generated bad predictions. Get rid of it. Of course, the problem is now you can't account for a lot of the other data. In particular, you can't account for the fact that Pierre read what usually sounds pretty bad. So this assumption that the highest copy is the one pronounced was doing some work in linguistic theory. It accounted for a lot of our other predictions. And so just getting rid of it when we found this counterexample, it can resolve the problem that we recently raised, but it does so only by creating a bunch of other bad predictions. And it's going to turn out that this is the same for any of these things. So let's say that we reject this proposal that this thing, that kind of obscure thing I said about this plus Q feature needing a nearby colleague. You can reject that hypothesis, and then you lose the explanation for what did Pierre read. If we want to know, this seems like a kind of crucial aspect of linguistic theory. We want to know, why do I ask the question, what did Pierre read? There's something puzzling about that. The thing I'm asking about is the object of the transitive verb, but instead of pronouncing the question expression as the object of the verb, as I do when I say Pierre read what, instead I do this weird thing where I move this expression to the front of the sentence. The way that we explain that was precisely by talking about these weird features that these complementizers have. So if we reject that, then we reject our account of question formation in general. And it turns out that in general, whatever we do, whatever theory of question formation we propose, if we want to account for the acceptability of sentences like Pierre read what, whatever we have to do to our theory to generate that prediction is going to get us into some trouble. So instead of doing this kind of traditional philosophy of science move where you say a bad prediction shows us that we need to reject our theory, generative linguists have largely adopted what Chomsky calls the Galilean style. So here's this little pithy quote about it, which says, look, Galileo was willing to say, look, if the data refute the theory, the data are probably wrong. The general idea here being that when we come up with this counterexample, rather than modifying our theory in this sort of way, getting rid of some of the hypotheses that generated the good predictions in the first place, instead you just get rid of the data. You say, I'm not talking about that. You exclude the counterexample from the purview of your theory. If you do that, then you're back in this nice situation where your theory and the data match well. We've excluded this data that we had trouble with. All that remains is the data that we correctly predicted. So, you know, all the better for our theory. So here's where the defective data stuff comes in. It looks like what we have here is a defective data set. We have a data set which precludes our ability to capture these sorts of broad generalizations. Broad generalizations can capture a lot of the data, but there are kind of problems with it. And there's this methodological response to bad data that's been adopted in generative linguistics, which says you just get rid of the bad data. Probably the most famous aspect of linguistic methodology is this thing, the competence performance distinction. And this is one way of motivating this Galilean style. You say, look, the data that we have are data about behavior. They're data about our performance. Whereas the system we're trying to describe, as we said at the beginning, we're not trying to describe productions of sounds. We're not trying to describe behavior, period. We're trying to describe an underlying psychological capacity. Call that competence. And so by distinguishing between the data that we get, which is performance, and the underlying capacity competence, you kind of justify this move of excluding this bad data. You say, people behave in this way, but that's not really what our theory is trying to capture anyway, so we're all right in just getting rid of it. Okay, so predictably enough, there's a lot of people who really don't like this strategy. And this is true in linguistics, it's true in psychology, it's true in philosophy, it's true in computer science. There's a bunch of people who find this maneuver really unpalatable. So here's just a few representative quotes. Here's William Labov, kind of the founder of sociolinguistics, probably after Chomsky, the most important linguist of the 20th century. It's now evident to many linguists that the primary purpose of the performance competence distinction is to help the linguist exclude data which he finds inconvenient to handle, right? And of course, the idea is, look, if you're just allowed to manipulate your data sets, which you're trying to capture in whatever ways you want, of course you can find a theory that makes only the right predictions. But that looks like a scientifically really bad strategy. Here's some more recent work from some psychologists, Ibbotson and Michael Tomasello. The idea of performance masking competence, that is the idea of there being this disparity between the data that we observe and the underlying competence, is also pretty much unfalsifiable. So again, drawing on this work in philosophy of science, obviously, retreats to this type of claim are common in declining scientific paradigms that lack a strong empirical base. So he's kind of mixing up his pupper and his lactose, but he's a psychologist. We'll let him get away with that. And then just this year, Ray Jackendorf and this phonologist Orjing. Jackendorf is kind of normally a defender of the Chomskyan strategy, but here he is saying why he dislikes this kind of Galilean approach. They say the theory, they mean here their theory, as opposed to a kind of generativist theory. Their theory aspires to be accountable to all the facts and not be limited by a competence performance. Or I'm not going to talk about core periphery distinction. That's an analogous kind of distinction between facts that are relevant for linguistics and stuff that linguists can ignore. So all three of these quotes seem to be getting on something quite similar. The general worry seems to be that if linguists are just allowed to exclude anomalous data from the purview of their theories, then they're kind of insulating their theory from the observations in a way that is kind of widely agreed to be methodologically bad. Most of the work in like mid-century philosophy of science, mid-20th century philosophy of science was about spelling out exactly what's wrong with doing this, right? Exactly what it is kind of depends who you ask. One worry you might have is it leads to a kind of confirmation bias, right? If you're a linguist with your favorite grammatical theory, you can say, oh, look, it deals with these cases so nicely. And then someone says, well, what about these other cases? And you say, I'm ignoring those. that looks like it's going to lead to people thinking their theories are better confirmed than they are. It's a kind of ad hoc maneuver. I say, here's my theory of questions. You say, here's this question, it doesn't fit it. And I say, oh, I wasn't talking about that. I'm kind of, modifying my theory in response to seemingly bad data. As Tomasello suggested, it leads to a kind of unfalsifiability. Again, it looked like what we had was a perfect example of a falsifier. We predicted the sentences could only be formed in a particular way. That wasn't true. It looked like, if we were going to be a good Popperian, we would say, I'm trying to falsify my theory at every opportunity. This gave me a great opportunity to do that. And so, we reject this proposal. But they did exactly the opposite. They did exactly what Popper thought, like Marxist historians or psychoanalysts did, right? They said, oh, I'm going to make my theory narrower in its scope than it was prior to coming across this counterexample. So whatever, exactly how you want to cash this out, it seems like they're doing what everyone in philosophy of science for a long time has thought was bad. And in response, theorists who are moved by this kind of worry, they often put forward quite different sorts of theories than the generativists. So generative linguistics aims to get these very kind of high-level abstract theories. They're supposed to account for not just a wide range of linguistic constructions within a language, but also account for generalities across languages. So they're going to claim that these constraints on question formation aren't just true of English, but actually they apply to all natural languages. But of course, the broader your claims are, the easier it is to come up with these apparently falsifying instances. And so the people who are moved by this sort of worry tend to promote much more kind of restricted linguistic theories. They tend to stick much more closely to the observations instead of framing their generalizations in these very abstract terms, like I did at the beginning, complementizers with plus Q features. Their generalizations are framed in terms of, English complementizers, or in terms of that, or something like that. They also include a wide variety of these exception clauses. They very narrowly define the stuff they're talking about. And many people have thought that makes them less explanatory, right? It's kind of old adage in philosophy of science that if you just stating a generalization doesn't actually explain anything. If you just point out, oh, every instance of F is a G, you haven't explained anything about any particular F's or G's, you just noted the regularity in the world. That's a good first step at doing science, but it doesn't really get us what we want, which is an explanation. And so it looks like there's a kind of trade-off here. On the one hand, we can have these very abstract and seemingly explanatory generativist theories, but they seem empirically inadequate. They seem confronted with all kinds of counterexamples. On the other hand, you can have highly empirically adequate theories, these sorts of more empiricist-motivated theories, which face far fewer counterexamples, but they don't really seem nearly as explanatory. They don't give us nearly as neat an account of why this stuff happens, but they do more accurately tell us what does happen. So there seems like there's a kind of trade-off here, and you could just end there and say, well, it depends what you're into as a scientist. Are you into this kind of empiricist project of just accounting for all the various particularities of the world, or are you interested in, this kind of more rationalistic thing of getting at really what's going on at some deep level, but our very messy observations tend to cloud that. You could just say this is a matter of kind of scientific or theoretical taste, but I want to do something more. I want to show how you can kind of manage to do both of these things. Let our linguistic theories stay constrained by the data, but still, but avoid doing this very narrowly defined thing. So this is my solution, what I call the explanatory economy. And I think the crucial maneuver is distinguishing between two notions of scientific confirmation. On the one hand, individualist notions, and on the other, collectivist notions. So an individualist theory of scientific confirmation says I can tell you everything there is to know about the confirmation of a particular theory just by looking at that theory and its relationship to the data. So I can determine to what degree a theory is confirmed without looking at any of the other theories. So as a scientist, maybe I need to look at other theories in order to do some kind of comparative work. I've got two theories, I need to know which one's better confirmed, but each of the theories' confirmation is attributed independently of the degree that others are. A collectivist theory denies this assumption and says in order to attribute confirmation to a theory, it's not enough to know how that theory relates to the data, does it explain or predict the data, but you also need to know what other theories are doing. In particular, theories of different targets. So to make this kind of case clear, I want to go back to one more case from the history of linguistics. Here's a proposal as to how we form relative clauses, or at least object relative clauses. Take a sentence containing a transitive verb. The cat caught the mouse. Take the object of the verb, move it to the front. The mouse the cat chased. Very easy recipe for forming object relative clauses. If that's our linguistic theory, we say object relative clauses are okay if we do that sort of thing. We correctly predict that the mouse the cat chased squeaked will be grammatical, and in fact, most English speakers think that sentence is fine. The problem is once we put that rule forward, we're very quickly confronted with cases that are generated by our theory, but for which English speakers deny that that is a good sentence of English. So this tree on the right is formed using exactly the same rules as the tree on the left. I've just applied this rule an extra time. So here we have a transitive sentence, the dog chased the cat. We form a relative clause, the cat the dog chased. We then do that again, and now we get the sentence, the mouse the cat the dog chased squeaked. Almost universally, people say that's not a sentence of English, but it's formed using exactly the same rules as all these other cases. For whatever reason, the fact that we repeat this procedure means that people can no longer view it as an acceptable sentence of English. So here, just to give another kind of pictorial account of the situation we're in, here's the theory. Here's how you form object relative clauses. Take an object, move it to the left. And again, we have this claim that it's the highest copy that's pronounced. So here we have the mouse occurs twice in this tree, but you can only pronounce the relative clause as the mouse the cat caught. The cat caught. The mouse is not a relative clause, it's a whole sentence. That gets these two data points correct. That gets this data point correct, but it predicts that this sentence is grammatical, but English speakers say it's really bad. So again, it has this problem. Here's what you could do if you adopted a kind of individualist perspective towards linguistics. Well, our job here is to come up with the theory that creates the best match between theory and data. So we just add something to our linguistic theory, which rules out this counterexample. So you say something like, you're not allowed to apply these rules more than twice. That would do it. Maybe more than once. You're not allowed to apply this rule twice. That correctly generates all the data we've just proposed. And so from this individualist perspective, it looks like this should be a better theory. Where our initial theory had a counterexample, this one doesn't. So just basing how good a theory is on the basis of its relationship to the data, this seems like a better theory. But this is not what any, as far as I know, linguist does in this circumstance. Instead, they adopt exactly this kind of Galilean style. You just ignore this data, you remove that data from the purview of your theory, and you say, my theory gets all the data, but that's because you're precluding this thing. And the reason that this isn't just this sort of ad hoc move that people have worried about, that you're not simply insulating your theory from the data, is because in making this sort of claim, you're thereby placing this data into the purview of another theory. So alongside our theory of syntax, we want a theory of parsing. So we distinguish between a theory of the grammar that we know and a theory of how our audio or visual systems identify the syntactic structure of sentences in our environment. So here's a very simple parsing theory. The job of a parser is identify noun phrases and assign them to the arguments for which they're verbs. And then you add this constraint on memory. You can only store 2 items in your short-term memory at a time. If you look at this sentence, if you ask how would such a parser deal with this sentence, well, it's going to go through the sentence left to right. It finds the noun phrase, the mouse, stores that in memory. It finds the noun phrase, the cat, stores that in memory. It hasn't yet assigned either of these to a verb, and so it just has to hold on to them until it does. But then it hits this new noun phrase, the dog, but it's memory constraint, which says you're only allowed to store two expressions in memory at a time. Can't do anything, so the whole system crashes. So a parsing theory can explain why this sentence is bad, even though it's been precluded from our theory of syntax. So I call this collectivist because if I want to determine how good a theory of syntax is, it's not enough to ask which data can it account for and which data can it not account for. I need to ask also, of the data that it can't account for, can those data be accounted for by some other theory? In this case, it's a theory of parsing, but it could be a theory of many other sorts of different things. So in the kind of general message is the confirmation of a theory depends not just on what it can do, but also how it complements other theories. So if we have one syntactic theory which excludes certain data, that can be perfectly legitimate as long as that data is accounted for by some non-syntactic theory. And so we could even think we could have 2 syntactic theories which cover kind of the same volume of data, but they exclude different apparent counterexamples. One of these could be much better confirmed than the other if the counterexamples they exclude are appropriately in the purview of some other psychological theory. And so this is a kind of defense of this Galilean style. I'm saying it is perfectly legitimate to exclude anomalous data from the purview of your theory, but it's a kind of amendment to it in that I'm saying that can't be the end of inquiry. If all you do is exclude the data from the purview of your theory, then you really are doing this kind of ad hoc, unfalsifiable, confirmation biasy thing. But if what you're doing instead is you're saying, I'm not going to deal with this data precisely because I don't think it's the kind of data that a syntactic, say, theory should deal with. In fact, I think it's the kind of data that some other theory, maybe a parsing theory, or maybe a perceptual theory, or whatever it is, by placing that data into the purview of another theory, you're not reducing the kind of empirical contact with theory and data overall. Instead, you're just apportioning the connection between theory and data differently. Whereas we might have originally thought these counterexamples were things that a syntactic theory should deal with. Instead, we're saying that there's something that a psycholinguistic theory should deal with. Just as a bit of kind of background, if you're wondering why I call it the explanatory economy, it's because I'm viewing one theory as indebted to another when it says, we're not going to deal with this data, but some other theory can. Yeah, so that's just what I've been saying this whole time. So the hope then is that this approach can retain the generality and explanatory depth of particular theories. The thought was you kind of reduce the generality or explanatory depth of your theories by adding all of these modifications in order to account for anomalous data. The hope is we can retain that initial generality and explanatory power by refusing to modify our theories in this sort of piecemeal way. But it does so without refusing to account for the data, period. Instead, the idea is we just exclude this data by putting it into the purview of some other theory. So we retain a kind of connection with observations, but it's distributed differently. So the view is that different theories have to account for different data. Okay, so I don't really have time to talk about further applications. I'll just say quickly, this problem is a problem that's going to occur in the study of any complex system, right? If what we want to account for is the behavior of a complex system, that's going to involve, just in what it is to be a complex system, a lot of different component parts working together. And so any theory of any one of these parts is not going to account for the overall behavior of the system. What we need to do is precisely come up with a way of kind of distributing the data between theories of different components. So in perceptual science, you can see this sort of thing come up. We have a kind of very broadly modular picture of perceptual science. We say your vision system doesn't depend on influence from other parts of your mind, namely your beliefs or desires. That explains why illusions are so consistent. No matter how much I know that these two lines are the same length, the bottom one looks longer. But there are kind of apparent counterexamples to this where it does seem like our beliefs or desires influence our perception. Famously, if you ask people to estimate the gradients of a hill which they're about to walk up, you put a big backpack on them and they estimate that it's steeper. So this is supposed to be an influence of top-down effects on visual system. But again, if we exclude this constraint, then we lose the ability to account for why illusions seem so persistent no matter how we vary our beliefs. So again, we can do this kind of divide and conquer approach. And there are various proposals in the literature that are trying to account for these top-down effects without attributing them to influences of the visual system per se. So in conclusion, I think just about any time you're dealing with a complex system, you're going to get this kind of defective data. You're going to get a set of data which enables us to make some generalization, but the generalizations always have counterexamples. And the explanatory economy points to the crucial step in linguistic theorizing generally of determining which of these observations are to be accounted for by which theories. Thanks, that's all I got.
We can start with the question.
Thanks. I think you're right in noticing the importance of those methodological constraints. And one worry I have is, in some cases, when you use a kind of divide and conquer strategy, you can do that in ad hoc ways or not. It depends on how the additional theory, what you're calling additional theory, maybe it's an extra hypothesis, deals with that phenomenon. Right? And that just brings back the issue of how successful was it that phenomenon are accommodated. So, because for example, in one of your slides, when you were considering, maybe the application of this rule, it's only once, so don't apply more than once, and that would account for why one of the sentences was ungrammatical. But the question is whether this is ad hoc or not depends on whether I'm unable to account for other things in which that rule could be actually applied twice without problem.
Yeah.
Right? So the issue there, I think, is it's a little more complicated because ultimately it needs, in each case, the rules need to determine how successful was it that the problem was solved. And that needs to be addressed.
So that's certainly right. Yeah. So the reason that I kind of like this debts metaphor is debts can be paid off or they may not. And it seems like a lot of what goes on in science when this sort of thing occurs is we're estimating how plausible is it that someone's going to be able to pay off this debt. So sometimes this sort of maneuver of saying, I'm going to ignore this data from my theory because I think another theory will account for it. Sometimes that looks really plausible. So in this case, there's nowhere else in syntactic theory where the number of rule applications seems to matter, right? the whole kind of driving force for generative linguistics is recursion. We want to be able to apply the same rules over and over again. But that's clearly not the case in memory, right? There are constraints on the upper bound of memory store all over the place. And so this kind of rule where you say you can only do this thing n number of times, that looks just much better suited to be in a memory-based account of these phenomena or a parsing-based account of these phenomena than it does for the grammatical case. But of course, there are other things where, saying we don't want our linguistic, say, theory to deal with this is handled by some other theory, is going to look really implausible. And so this move of saying someone else should deal with this theory is just the first step in this kind of inquiry. The next thing you need to do is say, well, can this theory actually do that? And sometimes it will be able to, in which case your theory is all good and you were justified in excluding this data from the purview of your theory. Sometimes it won't, in which case you might need to put that data back in the set that your theory is trying to deal with, and then it might be a genuine counterexample.
So I have a couple of points. One of them is actually very similar to what, maybe identical to what Ottavio was mentioning. Let me start with the other one, which is, so you drew this distinction between individualistic and collectivist, and that seems to be something that has been around. So, for example, John Worrell has been stressing how important it is when you talk about confirmation to look at confirmation of a theory in the context of a bunch of other theories. This he took from Lakatos. Lakatos famously made a whole point, of course, about all theories being born refuted. So all that we end up doing is then is comparing all these refuted theories, and we have to say how one might be better than the other, right? So that's really be nice for you, so that you can, you have something to fall back on, in a sense, a tradition to fall back on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I certainly agree, that one should look at multiple theories is not new to me. But usually when people make the point, it's been a while since I looked at Worrell, but usually when people make the point, it's something about generating predictions, period, right? In order to generate a prediction, say saying you're doing physics or something, and predict that the planets are going to be where they are, I need to rely on a bunch of other theories, say theories about how telescopes work, maybe theories about how the visual system works, all of that needs to go just to making predictions in the first place. That's a different point than I'm making.
No, that's exactly not the point I was.
Okay.
It's about evaluating theories, right? It's about confirmation, right?
Yeah.
That's precisely what they focus on, Lakatos and Worrell. Okay, let me go to the other point now, which is, so you said, so you were trying to kind of defend the Galilean style, you said, which to me sounds a little bit bonkers. I mean, if the data is bad, yeah, by all means throw away the data, but if the data is good, you can't really throw it away. What's not bonkers is, of course, that you can have more restricted theories that don't claim to take care of or explain all the data, right? In which case, that's fine, right? But what troubled me was that you weren't very, very clear to us. You didn't really give us any principled reasons as to when we decide that a theory is just, you can just worry about a particular subset of the data, and under what conditions you can worry about all of them. You haven't really given us principled reasons. I guess this is what Ottavio meant also, like it's more ad hoc, so you could go really wrong here.
Yeah, and I think that what I was saying in response to Ottavio is supposed to address this. That I think the question is, how plausible is it that this data that you're excluding does get handled by these other theories? And I don't have a principled way to make that decision, because that decision is a decision of evaluating scientific theories for plausibility. And nobody, as far as I know, has a good thing to say about that. But is this sort of data likely to be handled by theory too? There's all kinds of things that go into that.
Suppose they're not handled by any theories. Yeah. That still leaves us with a puzzle, right? So the puzzle is, if we allow now this data not to be handled by this theory, because the other ones don't either, right? What about all the rest of the data? Can we make the same move again and say, and suppose we go out collecting some new data, right? what do we do then? Do we also give this theory a free pass because we've given it already, right?
Well, I mean, but the fact that something is not handled for and doesn't even look like it could be handled by any other theory is pretty good reason to think that this theory had better deal with it.
But I'm extending it now, right, to further data, right? You gave the pass in respect to, you gave the theory this free pass in respect to this set of data, right, which the other theories are not dealing with.
Right.
What about other data?
I mean, the more data that comes in that your theory is offloading onto the others, it looks like your theory is not doing so well. That's right. I mean, the limiting case, you say my theory doesn't handle any data, well then you don't have a theory at all, right? So what we're trying to do is find a balance between my theory gives a nice account of these data, it does have these anomalies. Hopefully we have some reason to think these anomalies will be handled by something else. But this is scientific non-demonstrative reasoning. We could be wrong. We're making educated guesses. The more that we offload to other theories, the less successful our theory is. I'm not sure if this is addressing your... No. Sorry.
We'll continue.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I'm just wondering in connection to previous questions, and how could your proposal, based on the idea of collective confirmation, counter the problem of underdetermination of theories? Well, it is not a problem for the explanatory economy approach.
I mean, I just think underdetermination of theories by evidence is everyone's problem. I'm not trying to solve that problem, and I don't think that it could. Was there?
But my question is about the very notion of collective confirmation. Any theory of confirmation demands not only the criteria of adequacy in terms of the explanation of data, but also rational coherence. So when you say that one theory is confirmed by evidence because it is consistent or compatible with other theories, what does actually mean?
Well, I mean, I'm hoping that this can give us a way of being of rational theory selection. It's, I mean, it's an addition to traditional theories of, we still want some account of how data bears on a particular theory, but I want to say, in addition to that, it matters that, these theories play nicely together. And not just that they're, logically consistent with one another, but the data that they cover complements one another, in the set theoretic notion. If all the data covered by my theory and all the data covered by your theory are disjoint sets which collectively cover all the data, that looks like we're in a pretty good place. And so that gives us a further rational reason to favor one theory, because it fits well with the others.
Is complementary criterion an eventual confirmational one?
Yeah.
A sort of
I think the fact that
theoretical virtue.
I think it's an epistemic virtue. I think the fact that, say, generative
is empirical or is theoretical? Is a value or is a confirmation criteria?
I think it's a confirmation criteria. I mean, the fact that the data points that seem anomalous from the perspective of generative grammar are exactly the data that a theory of parsing mechanisms can handle looks to me to give me really good evidence in favor of both of these theories.
The last question.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your talk, very nice. And just following these comments, I was thinking like this is, from this Galilean point of view, from science point of view, you can treat this kind of data as support groups or outliers. So in some sense, you just remove them and then you go on with your theory and you're fine with that. The second part will be like, okay, let's say like, yeah, but how we know in advance, or like you have this data, you have this set of theories, you can see it from the individualistic point or collective, and then how to choose which one will be the right one. And it makes me think about the machine learning, where you have a set of theories, and you don't know which one is going to work for your data set. And probably you have an incomplete data set.
Right.
And then you start playing with some theory and try to minimize the cost or the difference among them. And then you go on like an iterative process to finally decide which theory will be more suitable. Probably not the right one, or not because you have an incomplete set, as we say. But it gets you closer and closer to do the right theory. So, I think this is in the context that you present here.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I mean, I think there's a difference between these kinds of the kinds of counterexamples I was talking about, and I mean, there are a particular kind of anomaly or extreme value that you get. I mean, one of the things that's particularly worrisome about them is that they're very systematic, right? Like, you can dismiss one weird data point in your set, but if you get, all your data sets have 10% of their data, right? That calls for explanation. But that's what you get here, right? Like, everyone finds these echo questions okay. Everyone finds these multiply embedded expressions bad. So they're not merely anomalous, they're anomalous and systematic. And that's why you don't just ignore them, you need some other theory to account for them.
Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
So, thank you everybody, thank you Kira, thank you Gabe. We are gonna have a break, a lunch break. Ideally we were gonna come back at 3 p.m., but it's already a bit late. So let's see each other here at 3:15, something like that. Latest, okay? So the ones that are gonna maybe that shouldn't be